Now, I mentioned before that Alexander Hamilton was probably one of the foremost economic thinkers of the time. And what's more, being put in charge of the Department of the Treasury, he's going to have a very, very influential post in creating what kind of economic policy is going to be, the predominant one in the United States. Now, remember, this is a point in time when the U.S. is still almost exclusively agricultural. We do not have a manufacturing base, but it's going to be through Alexander Hamilton's efforts that we are going to build up our manufacturing base and come to be known as a manufacturing nation that would at least rival and then eventually surpass Great Britain. Now, Hamilton was born in the West Indies, okay? And there were a number of times people questioned his loyalty to the United States. Now, he was one oft to say that he loved his adopted country much more than his native country. He had started off in the West Indies. Things had not gone well there. Father had abandoned the family. His mom eventually died of illness. And there were a lot of things stacked up against him until he was given the opportunity to go to school in New York. And once there, he really was able to excel. He became the aide de camp to General Washington during the course of the Revolution. He rose to the rank of colonel. And he was one of these guys that would quite literally, he read everything he could get his hands on. He really wanted to have a good understanding of economics and philosophy and politics and things like that. What's more, when he was in the West Indies, he did a lot of work for a shipping firm, so he had to be knowledgeable about exchange rates and things along those lines. So he had a really good business manufacturing background, and it was through his guidance that we're going to end up as that manufacturing nation that I mentioned. Now, he's going to put forward a plan that was not overly popular with everyone, but it turned out to be a great idea. Okay? He urged the federal government to pay off its debts of about $54 million and to pay them off at face value. This is called funding at par. Now, keep in mind, as a result of the Continental Congress, the Confederation Congress, and things like that, all this time, the national government was incurring debt. So we're at the point now where we've got about $54 million. And when it says to pay them off at face value, he's talking about paying them off at 100 cents on the dollar. So paying face value, plus interest. Now, he also, and this is where the controversy really came up, he wanted to assume the debts of the various states. Okay, now if you totaled up all the various state debts, you're looking at approximately another 21, almost $22 million. So right there, we're already talking about $75 million. And you think about $75 million, still a big chunk of money today in 2020, let alone you go back here to the late 1700s. So he wanted to go through and he wanted to assume all of the state debts, bring it into one national debt, and then we would start paying it off from there. He also wanted to go through and add to that a bunch of IOUs that had been written during the Revolution by generals like General Washington and others. And that was going to be about, I believe, another $7 million, give or take. So he was looking at putting together about an $80 million national debt that we were going to have to try and figure out how to finance and pay off. Now, this did not go well with everybody, as I said. Okay, for example, Massachusetts had a huge amount of debt, but Virginia did not. Okay, so there had to be some haggling. Okay, Virginia, they felt in their defense that it was unfair that all the debts would be assumed by the entire nation. Okay, basically saying, look, we went through, we were responsible, we paid off our debts, others didn't. And so as a result, why are they getting rewarded when we're not? Okay, that was the argument. Now, you also have to take into account that a lot of the debts that the states owed, these were in the form of bonds. Okay, people had bought bonds during the Revolution. Now, when things looked bad, there were investors who came in and they bought the bonds, usually at about 15 cents on the dollar. So there were those who also argued that really what we needed to do was make sure the money actually went back to whoever originally owned it, not whoever owned it right now. So that was going to be something of a nightmare as well. And since some people had paid 15 cents on the dollar, there were those who argued, why are we paying, just pay them the 15 cents they paid, No, he wanted to make sure that we were going through and we were paying it at par. We were paying the full face value. But like I said, Not all the states were very happy with this, okay, especially those, who now were seeing themselves as being punished for being fiscally responsible. So, what do? There is haggling afoot. There is some debate to be made. Now, I have said this before. We are good when we go through and figure out compromises. And that's essentially what we had to do here. Okay? So you've got happy states, you've got. The bargain was the following: Virginia would get the District of Columbia. That would be the new national capital. It would be built on land, therefore, it would gain prestige. It would be important, and it would look good to the Virginians that the capital was down in their neck of the woods. Okay? And in return, the federal government would assume all of the state debts. This funding at par would go through, and it would gain the support of the people who had money. They would be supportive of the federal government, not the states, because the federal government would go through, they would buy all this debt, they would then go through and reissue bonds and start all over again. Now, we right now have a national debt of approximately $26 trillion. Hamilton argued that a modest national debt, as long as it wasn't out of control, could actually be a blessing. What it did was, with this, we were able to go through and we were able to be observed by those around the world who could lend money as being a good credit risk. Those who could loan money knew that by loaning it to the federal government, they would get their money back, and therefore they were willing to lend to us. Now, granted, at this point in time, with $26 trillion, pretty confident that's not exactly what Hamilton had in mind, but it is where we are today. Back then, the good news was that the federal government was able to assume all of those debts. All of the states would agree to this. The southern states would get the capital essentially. Everybody would be happy enough, and we would go on and start our merry way toward becoming a financial and industrial powerhouse.